When beekeepers think about things that kill bees, the first things that come to mind are like the pests such as varroa and the pathogens such as the many viruses or nosema. They might think about American foul brood, nutritional stress. They might think about pesticide exposure or small hive beetles. Beekeepers know that lots of things kill bees. But if you look at survey data, year after year after year, beekeepers report bad weather as a significant threat to honeybee colony health. Bad weather is not something you see given in presentations by beekeepers or bee scientists at beekeeping meetings. You don't hear it talked about in the halls. But every year, it's a top 5 stressor and killer of honeybee colonies. So if there should be videos about varroa and queen-related issues and nutrition, then there should be videos about weather. This video is all about weather impacts on colonies and a bit about how to mitigate those issues. When thinking about weather, I'm going to split it into a handful of categories: too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, windy, and natural disasters. And I know that these particular issues are intimately connected because you can have hot, wet seasons and hot, dry seasons and windy, cold seasons and so forth. But I want to talk about each one individually because there's different management strategies that you would do to try to fight the effects of these different weather parts. And so if they come together in hot, dry, or cold, wet, for example, then you would integrate a number of strategies to mitigate the impacts of weather. Now, I'm going to just be up front. There are no plastic strips that you can hang in a hive and control bad weather. Weather is a powerful force. I travel all around the world, and everywhere I go, people think they have the world's most unique weather. Oh gosh, it's changing all the time here. Well, everywhere you keep bees on planet Earth, you will have something that qualifies as bad weather that's going to impact your bees. No place is unique in that regard. Of course, I'm coming to you from Florida as a result of working at the University of Florida, but everywhere has bad weather. So let me talk about some of these issues and then a bit how to mitigate them as I go through weather events. And I'm going to start with too hot. Bees battle heat by working to thermoregulate their cluster. If the temperature gets above roughly 94.5 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 34.5 degrees Celsius, they can't rear brood. When it gets too hot, the brood starts dying. When it gets too cold, the brood starts dying. But I'm focusing first on heat. So bees work actively to thermoregulate the temperature around the brood nest. So if it's getting real hot outside, the bees will collect water, bring those droplets of water back to the nest and sprinkle them around the nest, stand at the nest entrance, fan their wings, circulate air through the nest, and cool the nest. If it's too hot, then bees need access to water. They have to have lots of good resources that's good, clean water that they can forage and bring back to the nest. So one of the best ways to combat heat is to have ample resources of water in the environment that the bees can collect. Also, it can be a good idea to ensure that your colonies are in afternoon shade. The hottest time of the day, when the sun's going up right above the bees, it's maximum heat. Keeping your bees in afternoon shade can be very beneficial. And of course, all weather events are best weathered by bees that are maximally strong and maximally healthy. So ensuring they have enough food, making sure that varroa populations and queen-related issues are under control. Strong colonies with access to water and when possible in the shade will do best against heat. Well, what about too cold? Of course, everything I just mentioned are the same types of things that you would think of. Strong colonies, queen-right colonies, varroa under control, all of that is true. But cold presents a unique problem because unlike heat, where bees are trying to cool the brood area, in the case of cold, bees have to warm the nest. And it's really tricky in that regard because they don't need water to do that. They need honey to do that. Honey is the fuel that bees use to convert to the energy needed to heat that cluster and keep themselves alive and well. So having all those other stressors managed, queen-related issues, varroa, etc., that's good. But really in cold, bees need honey. They need ample energy reserves in order to burn that energy to create the heat that they need to keep themselves alive. So if you live in an area that's very cold and you have sustained cold temperatures longer than a day or two, what am I calling a sustained cold temperature? Something below, say, 10 degrees Celsius, somewhere in the mid 40s Fahrenheit. If you have sustained temperatures below that, where the high gets up to that, but it lasts a month or longer, then not only do you need good food resources, but you might also need to consider insulating the hive. Any insulation that you add to the nest makes it possible for bees to thermoregulate in the cold better. Now, here's where some conflicting information comes in. A lot of beekeepers have historically tried to provide ventilation, specifically upward ventilation in the nest, to take out that moisture that can accumulate in the nest over winter. However, there's a lot of new research that suggests inadequate insulation is what leads to the moisture buildup and therefore the need for upward ventilation. A lot of beekeepers just address that issue by having adequately insulated nest, not just on the side, but also on the top of that nest. Adequate insulation and adequate food reserves means the bees more often than not are going to be able to make it through that cold temperature. Now, in a place like Florida where we don't have prolonged cold temperatures, but we might get cold snaps, you still have to have food resources close to that cluster of bees. In cold, you've got to be able to anticipate the need for food. So feeding bees in advance of the cold temperature is absolutely important to the success of colonies if they don't have adequate food reserves. Trying to solve a food reserve issue when it's too cold is going to be very difficult because it's going to be hard to apply food to a hive during the cold in a way that the bees will be able to break that cluster and access the food. You really want the food already in the nest before those cold temperatures start. So we've talked about heat, we've talked about cold. Let's talk about too dry. Oftentimes, dry goes hand in hand with heat, but can also go hand in hand with cold. When it's too dry, especially in heat-related conditions, it's difficult for them to thermoregulate the nest. What do you think they need then? They need water. It goes back to water. Having that water in a situation that's too dry can impact them. I want to broaden it a little bit because right now I've only focused on how things such as heat and cold affect the nest. In the case of dry, it also affects the resources that the bees would be harvesting in the environment to bring back to their nest. If it's really dry, then the floral resources where nectar and pollen would normally be produced may no longer be adequate. You really then, in those cases, are going to have to ensure that bees have the food reserves they need in that dry dearth that could lead to a lack of floral resources. So enough food and enough water to combat that dry. What about too wet? What happens when bees are too wet? That happens all the time if you keep bees in tropical, subtropical, or even in some temperate regions. Here in Florida, we get a solid month of almost rain the whole July. Every day we can anticipate the rain coming in the afternoon, and usually that's not a problem for bees because it rains, we've got sandy soils, and it goes away. But if you keep bees in low-lying areas where water can collect, if lots of rain causes rivers or streams to swell, if you do that, or if there's too much swelling of local water bodies, your bees could be flooded out. Too much water can actually flood colonies, and you see this a lot, especially with natural disasters. A lot of beekeepers I know keep their bees in flood-prone areas. If the water rises, if the rivers rise or the streams rise, it can cover the nest entrance. I know during some hurricanes that we've had in Florida that the water has gotten so high that the bees ultimately suffocated in the upper centimeters of the nest because they could not get away. There was no way out. We tell people who live in flood-prone or wet areas to make sure you keep your bees out of low-lying, flood-prone areas and ensure that you have that upper entrance during the rainy time of year that bees can vacate the nest if they need to. Again, I see a lot of this reported specifically around hurricane season. Now let's think about when it's too windy. What are the threats to colonies when it's too windy? Well, the colony can be blown over. The lids can be blown off. You can get trees falling on colonies if it's too windy. You can get yard debris smashing into colonies if it's too windy. So what can you do to address that? If you know wind is going to be a problem, you can strap your colonies together so that the parts can't fall apart. You can also keep your colonies from being so tall that they themselves won't be directly affected by these gusts or these shears of wind. I always tell people, don't keep bee colonies directly under trees. I learned that personally when a live oak tree fell onto 5 of my colonies because it was so windy. You can also provide windbreaks for colonies. You can literally set up walls that will stop the prevailing winds that you get from a distance. I will say though, a lot of these issues can come together and manifest during periods of natural disaster, where there's a hot drought or a hot flood season that you weren't anticipating, or a prolonged winter that is so cold with feet or meters of snow that entire colonies get buried. In the case of natural disaster, it can often be very difficult to prepare for what Mother Nature will throw at you. You can watch the weather, you can anticipate what's coming your way, following these recommendations that I've given uniquely for hot, uniquely for cold, uniquely for wet, uniquely for dry, uniquely for windy, and unique all the way to these major natural disasters that we can have. There are some natural disasters that you just can't beat. Tornadoes, hurricanes, some things like that are just very difficult to address from a bee colony perspective. This is incredibly important because not only do beekeepers list varroa and all these other things as major issues, but weather year after year after year is an impact on bees. Keeping all these tricks of the trade in mind, making sure again that you've got queen-right colonies whose diseases and pests that you can control are controlled adequately, that have adequate food reserves, and that are otherwise stress-free. Those colonies are going to be a lot more likely to survive these inclement weather events than other colonies. If I had to put it all together and guess the time of year that we got colony losses that would be the greatest due to weather events, it would be during winter. You hear a lot of beekeepers talk about overwintering losses that they don't experience other times of the year. And that boils down usually to disease and pest control in late summer and fall, and food resources available in their hives starting in fall. Weather's a hard thing to beat, but you can manage around it in a lot of cases to ensure that your colonies stay happy, healthy, and productive.